In June 1944, the sun was already sinking toward the western horizon when Task Force 58 moved through the Philippine Sea, and in those fading hours, the moment that would define the night began to form, because by the late afternoon of June 20, the American fast carrier force under Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher had been chasing an enemy that refused to come closer, an enemy fleet that had launched its great air effort the day before and had lost it almost entirely. And now the question was no longer how to defend the carriers, but whether to risk everything to strike back, because the Japanese mobile fleet under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Husawa was still somewhere beyond the curvature of the Earth, retreating westward, just far enough that every mile mattered, just far enough that the daylight was running out, and every decision made on the flag bridge of USS Lexington carried consequences that could not be reversed once aircraft were committed. Because in carrier warfare there was a line that once crossed meant the ships themselves were no longer in control of what happened next, and by the afternoon of June 20, that line was approaching fast. The American carriers had been operating at extreme range for days, burning fuel, launching combat air patrols, recovering exhausted pilots, and scanning empty horizons, because the battle that would later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had already proven the superiority of American air power, but it had not yet destroyed the Japanese carriers themselves, and that fact weighed heavily on Mitscher and on Admiral Raymond Spruance, whose Fifth Fleet was responsible for protecting the invasion of Saipan. Because as long as Ozawa's carriers remained afloat, they represented a threat that cannot be ignored, even if their air groups had been shattered. Throughout the day on June 20, search aircraft fanned out from the American carriers in long arcs, flying farther than doctrine preferred, pushing endurance to the limit, because every additional mile searched increased the chance of contact but also reduced the margin for recovery. And the men flying those searches understood that if they failed to find the enemy soon, the window would close entirely, because carrier aircraft were creatures of daylight, and while night landings were possible, they were dangerous, rare, and usually avoided unless there was no other choice. By mid-afternoon, tension built across the flight decks as reports came in piecemeal, some false, some uncertain, some delayed by radio static and distance, until finally, shortly after 1600, a scout from USS Enterprise reported sighting the Japanese fleet at extreme range, nearly 275 miles away, bearing west, moving away, a contact that was real, verified, and immediately alarming, because it was farther than any previous carrier strike the Americans had attempted in combat, and the sun was already declining. On Mitscher's flagship, the message was received, plotted, and checked again, and the implications were immediately clear to everyone present, because to launch meant sending hundreds of aircraft to the edge of their endurance with little margin for error, little margin for delay, and almost no margin at all for recovery before darkness. And to not launch meant allowing the Japanese carriers to escape, to fight another day, to threaten future operations. And perhaps to claim later that they had survived the full weight of American carrier power, Mitscher requested permission from Spruance to launch, fully aware that Spruance was cautious by nature and deeply concerned with protecting the invasion fleet. And Spruance, after brief consideration, gave the authorization, understanding that the opportunity might never come again, and that even a partially successful strike could cripple Ozawa's force beyond recovery. At that moment, the path forward narrowed to a single decision, and once that decision was made, the carriers truly could not turn back, because the act of launching would commit not just aircraft and pilots, but the carriers themselves to a night of risk that could not be undone. On the flight decks of USS Lexington, USS Enterprise, USS Yorktown, USS Hornet, USS Bunker Hill, USS Wasp, USS Cabot, USS Monterey, USS Langley, USS Princeton, USS Belleau Wood, USS San Jacinto, USS Cowpens, USS Baton, USS Independence. The machinery of the strike came alive with controlled urgency as deck crews moved aircraft into position, chalked wheels, swung propellers clear, and armed bombs and torpedoes with practiced efficiency. Because by this stage of the war, the U.S. Navy had perfected the mechanics of carrier operations, even if the strategic gamble being taken was extreme. Pilots ran through checklists, tightened harnesses, and listened to final instructions, knowing the distance involved, knowing the fuel calculations, knowing that if anything went wrong, there would be no alternate fields, no friendly land, only the vastness of the Pacific below, because the carriers themselves would have to keep moving, turning into the wind, launching, then later recovering, and could not simply stop and wait. The air groups assigned to the strike represented the heart of American naval aviation in mid-1944. Hellcat fighters, Helldiver dive bombers, Avenger torpedo bombers, flown by men who had trained relentlessly for exactly this moment, but who also understood that training could not remove the fundamental uncertainty of combat at extreme range, especially when time itself had become an enemy. As the first aircraft rolled forward and lifted off the deck, climbing into the late afternoon sky, the reality of the situation became irreversible, because every plane that departed reduced the defensive strength available to protect the carriers if something unexpected occurred, and every gallon of fuel burned in the outbound leg was a gallon that could not be used to search for the deck on the way back. Mitscher watched the launches with a calm exterior that masked the weight of responsibility he carried, because he knew that the strike would arrive over the Japanese fleet near sunset at best, that anti-aircraft fire would be heavy, that coordination would be difficult, and that even if the attack succeeded, the greater challenge would be getting the surviving aircraft home. The strike force grew as more carriers completed their launches, forming up in the sky, turning westward and disappearing over the horizon, while below them the carrier decks were cleared, secured, and prepared for what would come later. Because once the planes were gone, there was nothing to do but wait, track reports, and plan for a recovery that might occur in full darkness. As the American strike raced west, its pilots flew with discipline and focus, navigating by compass and dead reckoning, maintaining formation, conserving fuel where possible, and scanning ahead for any sign of the enemy. While back on the carriers, the sun continued its slow descent, and the sea took on the darker hues of evening, and the sense of commitment deepened with every passing minute. Reports began to come back from the strike as it approached the target area, confirming multiple Japanese carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers spread across a wide area, maneuvering defensively. And when the American aircraft arrived, they attacked with determination, diving through flak, releasing bombs and torpedoes, and engaging in aerial combat where necessary, inflicting damage on carriers including Suikaku, Junyo, Hiyo, and others, sinking Hiyo outright and damaging additional ships, results that justified the decision to launch, but did nothing to solve the problem of distance and darkness that now loomed over the returning aircraft. As the strike completed its attacks and began to turn eastward, the pilots faced the most dangerous phase of the mission, because fuel gauges were already reading low, the sun was touching the horizon, and the carriers were hundreds of miles away, still moving, still turning, still constrained by the need to maintain formation and protection against any lingering threats, and there would be no illuminated coastline, no city lights, no landmarks to guide them home. Only the blackening sky and the faint hope of radio bearings and visual signals. On the carriers, the waiting became agonizing because Mitscher and his staff tracked the estimated return times and knew that the margin was vanishing, and as dusk deepened into twilight, the reality became unavoidable that many aircraft would be returning in full darkness, something rarely attempted and never on this scale, and the standard doctrine of the U.S. Navy did not provide comforting answers for how to handle hundreds of aircraft trying to land on moving decks at night after long combat missions. The carriers began to prepare for recovery, clearing decks, rigging barriers, checking arresting gear, and coordinating across the task force, while radio circuits buzzed with fragmented reports from returning aircraft, some reporting damage, some reporting wounded crewmen, some reporting dangerously low fuel, and some simply asking for bearings, because by now the carriers themselves were the only safe haven left. Mitscher understood that once the first aircraft began to arrive overhead, the situation would escalate rapidly, because each landing would require precision and calm, and any delay would cascade through the entire recovery cycle, increasing the risk for everyone still airborne, and the darkness would only make everything more difficult. As night fell fully over the Philippine Sea, the ocean became an indistinct void, and the carriers were reduced to moving islands of steel and light. And it was at this moment, with the strike force inbound, fuel nearly exhausted, and the sky growing black, that Mitscher made the decision that would define the night. Because standard procedure demanded blackout conditions to protect the carriers from enemy submarines and aircraft. But blackout would also doom many returning pilots who would never find the deck. And so he ordered the carrier task force to turn on their lights, to illuminate flight decks and superstructures, to shine like beacons in the darkness, accepting the risk of detection in order to give his airmen a fighting chance to come home. A decision that could not be undone once made, because it amounts the carrier's presence to anyone watching and committed them fully to the recovery. And as the first distant engine sounds began to emerge from the darkness, the night reached the point where the carriers truly could not turn back. And as those first engine notes grew clearer against the night air, the consequences of Mitscher's order unfolded immediately. Because across the task force, ships that had spent the war perfecting concealment now glowed openly. Deck edge lights blazing, landing signal officer platforms illuminated, island structures outlined against the dark. And this sudden constellation on the ocean was both a promise and a warning, because it promised guidance to exhausted pilots and warned every commander present that the fleet was now exposed in a way it almost never allowed itself to be, and there would be no reversing that exposure until the last aircraft was down or gone. The first returning planes appeared as indistinct shapes, their navigation lights flickering weakly, some flying erratic patterns as pilots tried to align themselves with moving decks in conditions few of them had ever trained for, because even experienced carrier aviators might log only a handful of night landings in peacetime and almost none after a full combat mission at the edge of endurance. And now this was happening not with a few planes, but with wave after wave, stretching across the task force, each pilot competing not with enemy fire, but with fuel consumption, darkness, fatigue, and the unforgiving geometry of a carrier deck that was still pitching and rolling. Landing signal officers stood exposed on their platforms, paddles glowing, voices hoarse from shouting instructions over radio and hand signals, because the margin for error had vanished, and every landing had to be judged instantly, wave-offs ordered decisively, barriers raised or dropped in seconds, and deck crews repositioned between aircraft with almost no time to spare. Because behind each landing, there were dozens more aircraft circling overhead, each burning the last precious gallons of fuel. Some pilots came in too high, others too low, some misjudged speed, and the sounds of engines throttling, propellers clawing at the air. And the resting wire snapping tight filled the night, punctuated by the heavy impact of wheels hitting deck and the sudden deceleration that told the pilot he was down, at least for the moment. But not every attempt ended cleanly, because the darkness concealed the deck's edges, the horizon, and the subtle cues pilots relied on, and as a result, aircraft missed wires, crashed into barriers, or struck parked planes, forcing deck crews to work under extreme pressure to clear wreckage before the next landing, sometimes pushing damaged aircraft over the side without hesitation, because sentiments could not be allowed to slow the process when men were still in the air. Across the task force, similar scenes played out simultaneously, because there was no single recovery deck, but many, each carrier fighting its own battle against time, physics, and exhaustion, while coordination between ships became critical. As damaged planes diverted, pilots called out the remaining fuel, and controllers tried to guide them to any available deck before it was too late. Some aircraft arrived with fuel gauges reading zero, engines sputtering as they lined up, landing by instinct and luck rather than calculation, while others simply could not hold altitude any longer and were forced to ditch near the ships, their crews hoping for quick rescue in the dark water before exhaustion or injury took its toll. The destroyers and cruisers of the screen responded immediately, lowering boats, shining searchlights, and maneuvering carefully among the carriers to recover downed airmen, adding yet another layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation, because these rescue operations had to occur without interfering with flight operations or colliding with other ships in the blacked-out sea beyond the carrier's illuminated cores. Mitscher monitored reports continuously, aware that every minute extended the fleet's exposure, and that any Japanese submarine or surface unit within range could potentially see the lights and act. But he also understood that shutting the lights off prematurely would sentence more pilots to the sea. And so the order stood, and the carriers continued to shine. As the hours wore on, fatigue set in not just among the pilots, but among the deck crews and officers, because flight operations that normally ended at dusk now stretched deep into the night, with no pause, no relief, and no certainty of when the final aircraft would appear. And the strain showed in small mistakes, near collisions, wires fouled and reset under pressure, and shouted commands that cut through the night air with an edge of desperation. On some carriers, landing cycles backed up as damaged aircraft blocked decks, forcing incoming pilots to circle longer than they could afford, while controllers rerouted them to other ships, turning the task force into a desperate network of moving runways, each one trying to absorb more aircraft than it had ever been designed to handle. The situation was compounded by the fact that not all returning aircraft were intact, because some carried battle damage from the strike, holes in wings, malfunctioning radios, or injured crewmen who could not assist with navigation, and these planes required special handling, increasing the risk to everyone involved. Meanwhile, the Japanese fleet, battered but not destroyed, continued its retreat into the night, unaware of the precise chaos unfolding hundreds of miles away. But still a latent threat, because if any element of it managed to locate the American carriers now, the illuminated task force would be an inviting target, and that knowledge weighed on every commander watching the night sky. Radio traffic grew dense, sometimes confused. As pilots overlapped transmissions, controllers tried to impose order, and reports of fuel states became more urgent. Because now the question was no longer how many planes could be recovered safely, but how many would be lost simply because the night was unforgiving. Mitscher faced constant updates showing that dozens of aircraft were still airborne with dangerously low fuel, and that some pilots were already making the decision to ditch rather than risk crashing on deck, a choice that carried its own dangers, but sometimes seemed preferable to the alternative. On some ships, the landing signal officers pushed themselves beyond exhaustion, standing for hours in the night wind, eyes straining, muscles tense, knowing that one misjudged signal could cost lives, while deck crews worked in teams that rotated only briefly, because there was no time for rest when the sky was still delivering aircraft. The glow of the carriers could be seen for miles, reflecting off low clouds and the surface of the sea, turning the task force into a luminous island chain in an otherwise black ocean. And this unnatural visibility made the night feel exposed, raw, and tense, as if the fleet itself were holding its breath. As midnight approached, the numbers began to tell a harsh story, because while many aircraft had been recovered, many more had been lost to ditching, crashes, or simple disappearance into the dark, and each loss represented not just a machine, but trained men whose absence would be felt long after the night ended. Rescue efforts continued relentlessly, with ships maneuvering carefully to avoid fouling flight paths while still responding to splashes and flares in the water, and the sight of exhausted airmen being hauled aboard from the sea provided brief moments of relief amid the ongoing pressure. But for every successful rescue, there were others that could not be completed in time. The cumulative effect of these operations pushed the task force to its limits, because fuel consumption for the ships themselves increased as they maneuvered. Aviation gasoline stocks dropped with every recovery cycle. Pilots who were out there flying in circles waiting to land soon started to find themselves completely out of fuel, some of which dropped into the sea. and the combined strain on Mitscher's nerves was immeasurable. And the sheer physical and mental fatigue of crews began to erode the smooth efficiency that American carrier doctrine relied upon. Yet there was no alternative but to continue, because as long as aircraft were still inbound, the lights had to stay on, the decks had to stay ready, and the fleet had to accept the risk of being seen. And this reality created a strange inversion of wartime priorities, where concealment was sacrificed for recovery, and survival depended on exposure rather than stealth. By the early hours of June 21st, the stream of returning aircraft thinned, but it did not end, and those that remained were often the most desperate cases. Planes that had become separated, pilots who had struggled with navigation, or crews that had circled too long waiting for a chance to land, and now arrived with almost nothing left. Controllers made difficult decisions, directing some pilots to ditch near rescue ships rather than attempt landings that might result in catastrophic deck crashes, a choice that balanced individual risk against the safety of everyone else still airborne. And these decisions weighed heavily on those who made them, because there was no certainty, only probabilities under pressure. The night dragged on, measured not in hours but in landings, each one a small victory, each one followed immediately by the knowledge that more aircraft were still out there, somewhere beyond the lights, listening for bearings, scanning for reflections, hoping that the carriers had not moved beyond reach. Mitscher remained at his post, receiving reports, authorizing diversions, and maintaining the order to keep the lights on despite the growing awareness that the fleet had now been exposed for hours, because the alternative remained unacceptable, and the commitment made earlier could not be reversed without abandoning men in the air. As the sky slowly began to lighten toward dawn, the final phase of the night approached, because the return of daylight would ease navigation, but also reveal the full extent of the losses, both in aircraft and in the exhaustion etched into every face on the carriers. And it would also reveal whether the risk taken had attracted any enemy attention during the long hours of exposure. The last stragglers arrived as the horizon began to show faint gray. Engines barely running, pilots barely holding themselves upright, landing with a final expenditure of skill and luck that brought them safely aboard just before fuel starvation would have made further flights impossible. And with each of these recoveries, the tension eased slightly, though it never fully released. As dawn broke over the Philippine Sea, the carriers began to secure from night flight operations. Lights dimmed, decks cleared, and the fleet returned to its accustomed posture of readiness. But the strain of the night lingered, because everyone knew that what had occurred was unprecedented, that the gamble had been enormous, and that its consequences were still being tallied. Reports compiled in the early morning hours showed hundreds of aircraft launched, many recovered, and dozens lost, not to enemy action, but to distance, darkness, and exhaustion. And this stark accounting underscored the cost of the decision made the previous afternoon. Yet, even as losses were counted, there was an understanding among senior commanders that the strike itself had delivered meaningful blows to the Japanese fleet, further degrading its ability to operate, and that the night's ordeal had not been endured in vain, even if the price had been high. Still, the fleet could not rest, because the battle was not yet fully concluded. Japanese forces remained at large, and the American carriers, now low on aviation fuel and with air groups depleted, faced the immediate challenge of reorganization, rescue of remaining survivors, and readiness for any renewed contact. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the calm surface of the sea and the scattered signs of the night's drama, the unresolved question lingered over the task force, because while the immediate crisis of recovery had passed, the broader implications of what had been risked and what might yet be required were far from settled. And the sense that the carriers had crossed a point of no return continued to hang over the fleet as it prepared to face whatever the next hours would bring. And that sense followed the fleet into the daylight hours of June 21, because with the immediate chaos of the night behind them, the reality of what had been done began to settle in, not as relief, but as a different kind of pressure, quieter and more enduring, as commanders assessed the condition of their ships, their air groups, and their men, and realized how close the task force had come to operational failure without a single enemy shell or torpedo striking home. The morning reports laid bare the imbalance created by the previous day's decision, because while the Japanese mobile fleet had been further damaged and pushed farther west, Task Force 58 had paid in aircraft losses that could not be quickly replaced, and in pilot fatigue that no amount of coffee or adrenaline could erase. And now the carriers had to operate in an environment where their offensive punch was reduced and their margins were thinner than at any point since the invasion of Saipan began. Flight decks were crowded with damaged aircraft pushed to the edges, some still bearing the scars of anti-aircraft fire from the strike. Others bent and scraped from night landings, and maintenance crews worked methodically to assess what could be repaired quickly and what would have to be struck below or jettisoned, because space itself was now a limiting factor, and every usable square foot mattered. Air group commanders tallied crews who had not returned, cross-checking names against rescue reports, knowing that some men might still be alive in the water or on rafts, drifting somewhere beyond the visible horizon. And this uncertainty added another layer of strain, because decisions about movement and fuel had to balance the need to remain in position against the moral and operational imperative to search for survivors. Mitscher and Spruance exchanged updates as Fifth Fleet adjusted its posture, because while the immediate threat from Japanese carrier air power had been broken, the enemy still possessed surface forces, submarines, and land-based aircraft that could exploit any American misstep, and the prolonged exposure of the previous night had not gone entirely unnoticed, even if no attack had materialized. Reports from intelligence and reconnaissance suggested that Japanese submarines were operating in the region, drawn by the scale of the battle and the obvious value of American carriers. And this knowledge forced the task force to resume more cautious formations, zigzagging and screening more tightly, even as rescue operations continued. Destroyers ranged outward to pick up additional downed airmen, sometimes guided by last known positions relayed hours earlier, and each recovery was a reminder that the cost of the long-range strike had extended far beyond the moment of bomb release over enemy decks. As the morning progressed, limited flight operations resumed, not for large strikes, but for combat air patrols and reconnaissance, because the carriers still needed to defend themselves and to understand where the Japanese fleet had gone. And these operations were conducted with an awareness that many pilots were flying on minimal rest, their judgment dulled by exhaustion, and their nerves still keyed to the stress of the night before. Landing signal officers rotated where possible, deck crews swapped out in shifts, and medical staff dealt with the accumulation of minor injuries, dehydration, and fatigue that came from sustained high-tempo operations, all of which contributed to a sense that the task force was operating closer to the edge than its outward appearance suggested. The near failure lay not in any single catastrophic event, but in the cumulative effect of decisions and circumstances that had converged over a single night. And now that convergence had to be unwound carefully, because one more misjudgment could still turn success into disaster. Spruance remained focused on the larger operational picture, prioritizing the security of the Saipan landings and the preservation of the fleet, and this meant resisting any temptation to pursue the Japanese carriers further west without adequate air strength and fuel, even though the instinct to press the advantage was strong among aviators who believed the enemy was on the verge of collapse. This tension between caution and aggression had defined the battle from the beginning, and it sharpened now, because the previous day's strike had demonstrated both the reach and the vulnerability of American carrier power, and neither lesson could be ignored. Mitscher, for his part, had to reconcile his responsibility for the air groups with the strategic directions set by Spruance, and while he did not regret the decision to launch the late strike, he was acutely aware that repeating such a gamble without necessity could risk everything the fleet had achieved. As the day wore on, weather conditions remained generally favorable, but scattered clouds and haze complicated long-range searches, and the Japanese fleet remained elusive, its damaged carriers retreating under cover of distance rather than air defense, because they no longer possessed the means to challenge American reconnaissance effectively.
This created a paradoxical situation in which the enemy's weakness increased uncertainty, because without clear contact, American commanders had to decide how much risk to assume in pursuing an opponent who could no longer strike decisively but could still inflict damage through submarines or surface action if given the opportunity. The air groups launched additional searches, flying conservative patterns to conserve fuel and reduce strain, and these flights returned with little to report beyond empty sea, reinforcing the sense that the decisive phase of the carrier battle had already passed, even if its consequences were still unfolding. Meanwhile, the accounting of losses continued, and as the lists grew more complete, the scale of the night's toll became clearer, with dozens of aircraft gone and experienced pilots missing, losses that could not be dismissed simply because the enemy had suffered worse.
Because every American carrier aircrew represented months or years of training and combat seasoning that could not be replaced overnight. This reality weighed on air group commanders as they restructured their remaining squadrons, consolidating aircraft, adjusting assignments, and planning future operations with a diminished pool of manpower, all while maintaining the outward appearance of readiness that the fleet's posture demanded. The near failure also manifested in fuel calculations, because the long-range strike and extended night recovery had consumed aviation gasoline at a rate that planners did not intend to repeat, and replenishment would require coordination with logistics units that were not immediately on hand, forcing a period of relative restraint in flight operations. Tankers would have to be brought forward, rendezvous planned, and the fleet's movement adjusted accordingly, all of which reduced operational flexibility at a moment when the broader Pacific campaign demanded sustained momentum. Beneath these logistical considerations lay the human dimension, because the men who had flown and worked through the night carried the experience with them, and while discipline and professionalism prevented overt signs of strain, the cumulative fatigue affected decision-making, reaction times, and morale in subtle ways that commanders could sense even if they could not quantify them. Conversations on mess decks and in ready rooms circled around the night landings, the near misses, the moments when fuel gauges dipped below zero, and the sight of lights blazing on the carriers, a sight that would stay with many for the rest of their lives because it represented both salvation and vulnerability in a single image. The Japanese perspective, though largely unknown to the Americans at the time, contributed indirectly to the near failure, because Ozawa's decision to withdraw preserved enough of his force to remain a consideration, even if its offensive capability was broken, and this meant that the American fleet could not relax fully or declare complete victory, because the enemy still existed beyond the horizon, wounded but not yet finished. As afternoon approached on June 21st, Spruance made the decision to break off pursuit and refocus on covering the Saipan operation, a choice that acknowledged both the success and the limits of what had been achieved. And this decision effectively ended the Battle of the Philippine Sea as an active carrier engagement, even though its ramifications would continue to shape operations for weeks. This choice also underscored how close the fleet had come to overextension, because had the night recovery gone worse, had more aircraft been lost, or had an enemy submarine found the illuminated carriers, the narrative of the battle could have shifted dramatically, turning triumph into costly setback. Instead, the outcome remained favorable, but the margin was thinner than official communiques would suggest, and those who had lived through the night understood this instinctively. As the fleet settled into a more routine pattern of operations, the memory of the previous night did not fade, but instead became a reference point, a quiet benchmark against which future decisions would be measured, especially those involving long-range strikes and night operations. The near failure lay in the recognition that even overwhelming superiority could be stretched to a breaking point by distance, time, and human limits, and that the line Mitscher had crossed by ordering the lights on was not just a tactical choice, but a revelation of vulnerability that would inform American carrier doctrine going forward. Yet in the immediate aftermath, there was little time for reflection, because the Pacific War continued to demand attention, and the carriers, despite their losses and fatigue, remained the sharp edge of American power. As June 21st drew to a close, the task force steamed steadily,
decks quieter, skies less crowded, but the unresolved tension of the near failure lingered, because while the worst danger had passed, the fleet now carried the weight of knowing how close it had come to losing control of events, and how much depended on decisions made under conditions that would never be repeated in quite the same way, leaving the final judgment of that night suspended between success and catastrophe as the campaign moved inexorably forward. And it was within that suspended judgment that the Battle of the Philippine Sea finally resolved itself, not in another dramatic clash, but in the quieter, methodical consolidation of results that followed June 21. Because as Task Force 58 settled into its covering role for the Saipan landings, the full meaning of what had occurred over those 2 days became clear through reports, intelligence intercepts, and the slow accumulation of confirmed outcomes. The Japanese mobile fleet, once envisioned as the decisive instrument to break American carrier power, had been effectively shattered as an offensive force, not only by the catastrophic losses of June 19, but by the cumulative damage inflicted during the long-range strike of June 20. And while several Japanese carriers remained afloat, their air groups were gone, their decks empty of trained pilots, and their ability to influence the campaign permanently broken. Ozawa's surviving ships continued westward toward Okinawa and the home islands, operating under strict fuel constraints and without meaningful air cover, because the attrition suffered by Japanese naval aviation could not be repaired in weeks or months, but would take years that Japan no longer possessed. For the American fleet, the resolution came in a different form, as the carriers resumed a steady operational rhythm, replenished fuel and aviation gasoline from fleet oilers, reorganized air groups, and prepared for follow-on missions, all while maintaining pressure on Japanese positions throughout the Marianas. The men who had endured the night of illuminated decks now carried forward a shared understanding of what carrier warfare had become in mid-1944. A form of combat defined not only by firepower, but by logistics, endurance, and the management of risk at scales never before attempted. Official after-action reports began to circulate among senior commanders, documenting the unprecedented distance of the June 20 strike, the losses incurred during night recovery, and the decision to illuminate the fleet. And while these reports maintained the restrained tone of naval documentation, they nonetheless captured the essential reality that the operation had succeeded because of disciplined execution under extreme conditions, rather than because of flawless planning. Mitscher's decision was recognized within the Navy as one born of necessity, rather than doctrine, and its success did not lead to a wholesale embrace of night recoveries under combat conditions. But it did influence training, equipment development, and procedural refinement in subtle but lasting ways. Improved deck lighting systems, better approach aids, more rigorous night landing training, and clearer guidelines for long-range strike planning all emerged from the lessons of the Philippine Sea, not as dramatic innovations, but as incremental adjustments grounded in hard experience. For Spruance, the outcome validated his broader strategic caution, because despite criticism from some aviators who believed pursuit should have been pressed more aggressively, the destruction of Japanese naval aviation achieved the primary objective of securing the Marianas, and this, in turn, opened the path for future operations against the Philippines and ultimately the Japanese home islands. The Saipan invasion proceeded without further interference from Japanese carrier forces, and the island's capture provided airfields that would soon bring B-29 bombers within range of Japan, a strategic shift of enormous consequence that traced directly back to the decisions made during the battle. Within Task Force 58, the immediate aftermath was marked by a gradual normalization of operations, but the memory of the night lingered in quiet ways, in the careful tone of flight deck briefings, in the emphasis placed on fuel management, and in the unspoken respect for the limits of both men and machines. Pilots who had ditched and been rescued returned to duty when possible, carrying with them stories of black water, flares drifting in darkness, and the relief of hearing engines and voices nearby, while those who did not return were commemorated in simple shipboard ceremonies that acknowledged loss without spectacle. These moments underscored that the victory achieved was not abstract, but built from individual experiences that varied widely in outcome and cost. Japanese records examined after the war would confirm what American commanders could only infer at the time, that the mobile fleet's air arm had been effectively annihilated, and that the long-range strike, despite its losses, had accelerated the collapse of Japanese carrier aviation by destroying ships and equipment that could not be replaced. Yet, this retrospective clarity did not diminish the uncertainty that prevailed in the days immediately following the battle, because commanders had to act without full knowledge, making prudent choices based on partial information and hard-earned intuition. As the fleet moved on to subsequent operations, including strikes against Guam, Tinian, and later the Philippines, the Philippine Sea receded into the background of an expanding campaign. But it remained the reference point within the Navy, cited in staff colleges and planning rooms as an example of both operational brilliance and inherent risk. The carriers themselves continued to evolve as instruments of war, growing in number, improving in capability, and benefiting from an industrial base that could absorb losses and generate replacements at a scale Japan could not match. And this imbalance, once established, became decisive in the Pacific. The resolution of the night when the carriers could not turn back was therefore not a single moment of closure, but a convergence of outcomes that unfolded over time, as the Japanese Navy lost its ability to contest control of the air and sea, and the U.S. Navy consolidated a dominance that would carry it through the final year of the war. Mitscher continued to command fast carrier forces with distinction, his reputation shaped in part by the willingness he had shown to accept risk in order to preserve his airmen, while Spruance went on to lead further major operations, his judgment affirmed by the strategic results achieved under his command. For the men who served on the flight decks and the cockpits, and in the engine rooms, the experience became part of a shared institutional memory, one that reinforced the understanding that modern naval warfare demanded not just courage but adaptability, restraint, and an unflinching awareness of consequences. As the summer of 1944 progressed, the Pacific War moved inexorably closer to Japan, and the shattered remnants of the Japanese carrier force never again mounted a comparable challenge, appearing only in diminished form at Leyte Gulf, where their role was reduced to a decoy rather than a decisive striking arm. In this way, the outcome of the Philippine Sea extended far beyond its immediate tactical results, shaping the strategic balance of the war and confirming that the era of Japanese naval aviation dominance had ended. The illuminated decks of June 20 and 21 did not become a symbol of recklessness or desperation in American naval history, but rather a testament to the reality that decisive moments often emerge from the intersection of planning and improvisation, where commanders must act with incomplete information and accept risk in order to avoid greater loss. When the carriers finally turned back toward more familiar patterns of operation, they did so having crossed an invisible threshold, one that demonstrated both the power and the vulnerability of carrier warfare at its extremes, and the Pacific Ocean, indifferent and vast, absorbed the traces of that night without record, leaving its imprint instead on doctrine, memory, and the course of the war itself.